I'm a firm believer that the best way to learn a new language is to use it as much as possible in your day-to-day life. I remember 3 years ago, when I really wanted to take my Swedish to the next level, I decided to push myself and go through 1 month of only speaking Swedish. I had never done something like this, and I didn't really have the confidence to live my life in Swedish totally until after that experience. I made a huge gain and I felt very comfortable having pushed myself through those periods that felt really uncomfortable. It gave me the confidence that I was able to speak Swedish in my day-to-day life. Over the next few years that followed, I had this confidence to live my life in Swedish if I wanted to, but I didn't necessarily do it all the time because Swedish people are so good at speaking English. And depending on the situation, some people I would prefer to speak English with, some people I would prefer to speak Swedish with, but gradually over time, I felt myself going more and more towards the English side of the spectrum. So I decided to take back control, to do 1 more month, another follow-up challenge, if you will, to really lock in the language once again. So I've just, as of today, finished 1 month of speaking only Swedish in my day-to-day life. So if you watch the last 3 videos on my channel, you'll see that I'm only speaking Swedish in those videos with English subtitles, which is a ton of work to go in and write all the subtitles for the videos. But I thought that that was important so that even people that don't speak or understand Swedish could watch those videos and understand what was going on. But in this video, we're speaking English again, so I don't need to do all the subtitles underneath the video. But basically, I want to take the opportunity to go over 5 lessons I learned going through this experience for a second time of speaking only Swedish. And I'm hoping that by sharing these lessons and insights that I've learned, that for those of you that are trying to learn Swedish, you'll find it interesting and maybe learn some things that you can incorporate into your language learning journey. Learning a language is never easy. It takes a lot of time. It takes a lot of dedication. But as I was saying, if you incorporate it into your life as much as possible, that is the best way to learn it as quickly as possible. So at the end of the video, I want to introduce you guys to a new immersive language learning experience that me and 2 friends are developing. So for those of you that want to learn Swedish as quickly as possible, that could be a very, very interesting opportunity for you guys. But more on that at the end of the video. Let's jump into the 5 things that I learned. The first lesson that I learned is that humans have a very natural tendency to want to communicate in the language that is easiest for both parties. For example, with some Swedish friends that I have that are a little bit less comfortable speaking English, it's very natural for me to speak Swedish with them because my confidence in Swedish might be higher, for example, than their confidence in English. So we always choose the language where both parties are the most comfortable. And during this month of only speaking Swedish, I found it the most challenging to speak Swedish with people who had a lower level of Swedish. And on the flip side, with some of my best Swedish friends who have lived and spent a lot of time in the US, their English level is so good, they speak English basically without an accent. You might not even be able to tell that they are Swedish if you only heard them speaking English. For me to speak Swedish with them also felt inconvenient because in our normal interactions, they're so good at English, and English is my native language that it just normally wouldn't make sense. So in this challenge, I noticed that these were the 2 toughest people to stick to this challenge of only speaking Swedish with, the people that were just so good at English and the people that were not necessarily good enough at Swedish. And that's a concept that I had never really reflected on before doing this. The second lesson I learned is that you don't need to have a super large vocabulary to be fluent and confident speaking a language. If you watched the last video I did on my channel where I did a language challenge with my friend Caroline, she chose 4 difficult Swedish words and I had no idea what they meant. I think most of the Swedish people in the comment section, they also said, okay, she chose very, very difficult words. But if I take another example, I remember speaking Swedish with my girlfriend's niece who is 4 years old, and we were playing a spelling game. So there was pictures of different household items, like one of them was a Now I can't even think of the word in English. A nail that you would like nail a tent into the ground or like nail wood when you're building a house or something. I couldn't think of the Swedish word for nail, for example. And it seems like a very, very basic word that you would know if you speak a language fluently. And my girlfriend's niece, who's 4 years old, is like, yeah, it's this word in Swedish. And I was like, wow, I don't even know the word for nail in a language where I do consider myself fluent. And it got me thinking, like, you only need to know around 1,000 to 2,000 words to be fluent in a language. But what's more important is that you're able to understand when people are speaking to you. So there's really two types of vocabulary. There's your active vocabulary, the words that you can recall. And if you have those 1,000 to 2,000 words in your active vocabulary, you can make yourself understood. You can use different words to describe things that you don't necessarily know the word for. But you need to have a much larger passive vocabulary when you're listening so that you can understand people in a wide variety of situations. So prioritizing listening is hugely important when learning a language. And once you get to this point where you've lived your life and you have this confidence in a language, you don't necessarily need to have the largest active vocabulary ever to be fluent. As long as you can make yourself understood and understand what's going on around you, those are the most important things. The third insight that I really noticed from this experience is that your vocabulary could be very strong in one area and just completely not very good in another area. And I noticed for me in subjects and areas where I speak in Swedish quite often, for example, I only speak Swedish at the workplace with my bosses and with most of my colleagues at the workplace. So I feel like I have a very, very strong grasp when it comes to business Swedish. But when it comes to other areas, when I'm watching the news, I don't normally watch the news. So I have to focus really hard, and there's a lot of topics and words that can be really difficult for me to understand when I'm watching the news, for example. It also made me reflect on another language that I'm learning, which is Spanish. And when I go to Spain and I'm using my Spanish, the most common situation that I'm using Spanish in is ordering food at a restaurant. So if I go to a Spanish restaurant with friends and they hear me order food in Spanish, they might think that I sound quite fluent. And that's because I have a very good vocabulary when it comes to food, drinks, and ordering things at a restaurant. But if you throw me into a different situation with vocabulary that I'm not comfortable with, I'm going to have a much more difficult time hanging with and actually understanding what's being said to me. So this idea of having different vocabularies in different areas of the language is very, very fascinating to me. The fourth thing that I noticed throughout this challenge is that Swedish people are really, really good at English, and there's a lot of people in Sweden that just don't speak Swedish. A lot of people from abroad, they don't take the time to learn the Swedish language because, say, for example, you come from Italy or France or China and you move to Sweden. For those people, English is already their second language or third language. So they focus on learning English because it's very, very applicable around the world, and maybe they have more exposure to English in the past than Swedish. So I notice a lot of times if I'm going to a restaurant, for example, the other day I went to an Italian restaurant and I tried to order in Swedish, and the Italian person serving me was like, okay, I don't speak Swedish, you have to say it in English. And here I was in Sweden trying to live my life in Swedish, and there was still opportunities where I needed to use English in order to communicate with people in Sweden, which is sort of mind-blowing. The fifth and final insight that I realized throughout this challenge is that I have a very natural tendency to reply to people in whatever language is spoken to me. I really tried my best to only speak Swedish. But when people would ask me a question in English, I had a very hard time processing that question in English and then formulating the answer and speaking back to them in Swedish if it was a Swedish person. If somebody asks me a question in Swedish, my brain is already in Swedish mode and I'd have no problem answering that question in Swedish because I would process it in Swedish and answer in Swedish. But the times that were most difficult for me to stick to the challenge of only speaking Swedish is when I would get the inputs in English. And when you are in Sweden, you get so much input in English because a lot of the TV shows and movies and music and all of this stuff is in English all the time. It just makes it so difficult to get into this headspace where you start to think in Swedish, dream in Swedish, process everything in Swedish. And this is why my friends and I have started a program called the Language Lock-In. The idea of the Language Lock-In is to basically take people that are trying to learn Swedish and put them in a house where they are forced to speak Swedish and where they're just constantly surrounded by Swedish all of the time. So we've rented a beautiful property in Dalarna for this summer from August 25th to September 3rd. And there's 10 spots available. Well, actually there's only 7 spots available now because 3 of them are already taken and signed up and accounted for. But basically, if you choose to go through this experience, you're gonna have 9 days staying in the house. And this immersive experience is used as a springboard so that then when you come back into your day-to-day life, you have a lot of confidence. You're already thinking in Swedish from being in this very immersive environment. And the goal is to get you over the hump so that when you get out of this 9-day experience, you can continue to live your life in Swedish. And we're gonna follow up the time in the house with a month-long Swedish challenge, just like what I've just done and what I did several years ago, which got me over the hump and gave me all the confidence I needed to fully live my life in Swedish. So if this sounds interesting to you guys and you want to have more information about this program, I will link it down below in the description. I'm super excited for it. And I think it's going to be so interesting to see how much of a difference people can have in their language skills if they're really immersed in it and really pushed to the max in a very short period of time. It's going to be a little bit of an experiment. This is the first time we're doing this, and I don't know of anyone else in the world that has created an experience just like this. So if you want to be one of the first ones to experience this for yourself, be sure to check it out. And with that being said, I'll see you in another video.